Liam, shall we just start with your thoughts on criminological research?
Well, I've made a few notes, and first of all, I felt that it's important that any research adheres to ethical guidelines, so takes into consideration issues such as gaining consent from participants, keeping information obtained about participants confidential, and also ensuring that any research carried out is of note, doesn't cause any harm to either people that you're researching or to yourself as a researcher. So that was like the main point I thought of. I thought it's important to stay impartial as well, so that if you are perhaps researching quite a controversial area, it's kind of important to keep your personal views separated as such and not let it influence your judgment and your research. And I said it's also good to have a clearly defined standpoint, so approach an issue from a certain viewpoint, whatever that viewpoint may be. So yeah, that would be the main things that I came up with.
Okay, thank you. We'll go around and find out what everybody thinks before we discuss those points, but those are really good points. Have you got something different, Hayley?
The low harm risk in conducting research. There's always got to be an understanding of the risk of harm, not only to yourself but also to the participants and their surrounding areas as well. Conducting research in a vulnerable area will always not necessarily impact on immediate harm, but could cause later harm to the participant.
Okay, so for you that would be a really important aspect of starting out your research. Did you have any points that were similar to Liam's?
Again, with the bias, really. I think you conduct a piece of research with your own opinion already in place, and I think if you're not very careful, that will always come across in your work, no matter how neutral you try to be. So I think it's better if you recognise that bias and address it at the beginning of the research before conducting and writing it up.
Okay, I think we'll come back to that point because it's a really interesting one and one that I find usually comes up with this particular study. So we'll definitely come back to that in a moment. Okay, Shona.
Yes, I think the main point, like what Liam was saying about the ethics, and I think also to show some sensitivity in some of the areas that you could research in criminology. But also, I think it's very important before you start your research to have read or researched the area thoroughly before you undertake your own research, for the reasons that obviously you will have your own viewpoint, and to at least have other opinions rather than just be biased, and also just be aware of the bias in your own research.
Okay. Wendy.
I said one of the most important things when you're doing research is it's got to have some value to it. There's got to be a point to it. You've got to be able to further knowledge, or at least corroborate previous studies or knowledge in a field on a certain subject. So that to start off with, you've got to have a very, very clear undertaking as to what you're trying to achieve. Yes. Because then hopefully that would help structure ethical considerations and sampling, etc., etc. If you've got a very clear idea of where your study is going to fit within the field of knowledge that's already available, or indeed if it's breaking new ground, and then because then it would help for your research to flow well, to produce a cogent argument, and therefore everything else can hang on that. And I said that it's got to be very clear, it's got to be rigorous, it's got to be replicable. Somebody's got to be able to understand what you've done, how you've done it, and therefore if they was to so choose could replicate your study, would be able to do it and to corroborate or knock down your findings, and therefore you've got to be detached, so therefore you've got to be very objective. You've got to take a very objective line of it all.
Okay, thank you, because that again has raised some interesting issues that we can come back to, certainly in relation to Cowburn's article. And it tells me a little bit about the sort of research probably that you've been involved in most. as I'm listening to you. And it might be that other people carry out research in a slightly different way and that might not be replicable, but it might be very valuable. So we need to come back to that. It's a really interesting point. Abby, last but not least.
Okay, well, I'm new to this. Just to expand on what Hayley, just to expand on what Hayley said about protection of participants, I wanted to talk about identifiable data and how it shouldn't be put out into the public domain. And if it is put out into the public domain, to just make sure that participants give their consent and the researchers comfortable as well with putting whatever details they have out. I also wanted to expand on reliability and validity. There may be studies that have been done before with the same approach and with the same contents, but there can be inconsistencies. So background knowledge, just expanding on what you said, background knowledge I think is crucial. Ethics and definitely limitations are very crucial. And just protection and sensitivity and empathy.
Lovely, thank you. So as a starting point, that is really brilliant. Before we start talking about Calburn's article specifically, could I just ask you whether you could put a name to the different sorts of research that are carried out within criminology and within social sciences more generally? There are different forms of research that can be carried out. And I think particularly Wendy articulated one particular form of research, and Abby also talked about research criteria that are linked to that form of research. Can any of you put a name to that?
It's like experimental.
Well, it is like experimental. It sort of follows science, doesn't it? So it follows natural science. So we call that a theory of knowledge. So the idea that criminological research can, and some people think should, be carried out in a way that emulates natural science, has a name. It's called positivism. Okay, so usually that's the name we give to it, and that's one way of carrying out research within social science and within criminology. But there are other ways of carrying out research as well. And the criteria by which we actually evaluate those different types of research will vary, because the criteria that are appropriate for a more scientific study won't necessarily be appropriate for a smaller scale in-depth study. Do any of you know other forms of research then? Have you heard of the word positivism? Yes, okay. So are there any other research traditions, theories of knowledge, epistemology? I'm using those as three terms that we could talk about.
Feminism and humanistic, is that what you're talking about?
No, I would call that a theoretical perspective. So I'm talking about a theory of knowledge, or epistemology is the grand word for it. Okay, so one theory of knowledge is that social science can copy natural science, and that theory of knowledge is called positivism. Another theory of knowledge where researchers want to actually get hold of a lot of detailed information, but usually on a much smaller scale, has another name. Does any of you know that?
Qualitative research.
Well, usually it's qualitative research, but
Case studies.
can be. It's the word I'm trying to get at is interpretation and interpretivism, because it is about interpreting, whereas a scientific approach wouldn't be about interpretation. that would be seen as outside of a scientific remit very often. Okay, so that was the second one. There is a third one, which actually not so many people talk about, but that I think is really important. I mean, that's my view, and within research there are lots of debates that go on. But there is a third theory of knowledge.
Realist tradition, perhaps referring to?
Yes, Andrew, I think I will put a word in front of that, of the realist, so I will call it critical. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so and so that is a mixture in a way of science as well as actually using theory very much at the centre of research. And that sort of brings us back to a lot of the points that you were raising in general at the beginning. So what I'd like us to do now is to think about the Cowburn article. A few of you talked about a standpoint, coming from a standpoint. I think, if I've remembered it correctly, I think Hayley was saying, well, it's important to state what that standpoint is, whereas I think, Wendy, you were talking about being detached. So do you think that Cowburn was detached?
No. He conducted his research with pro-feminist standpoint, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's pro-feminist himself, but just that he took that approach to conduct that research. When he was conducting the research and he found difficulties in obviously applying pro-feminism when he was trying to blend, because obviously there's a lot of sympathy in pro-feminism. There's a lot of sympathy towards weaker groupings within society and in research. So when he was conducting that, it was hard for him to play on fitting in and not being sympathetic. Whereas as he was interviewing sex offenders, they would be seen as a weaker grouping as they are vulnerable adults. But he found it, he said that he had trouble keeping neutral while trying to get them to recognise the faults in their offences.
Okay, that's a really good point, because he did talk about staying neutral within the process of the research. Okay, so his stance at the outset was influenced by a particular theoretical perspective. Okay, but he tried in the process of doing the research to make sure that he didn't lead anybody into giving him the data that he wanted, as it were. Okay, so that's great. Wendy, what did you think?
So what you're saying is that you're allowed to have. So we're saying that it's the execution of your research to be neutral, however you can state your own particular standpoint, or you can acknowledge it.
Yes.
Even if you're wanting, but that doesn't detract from the quality of the study once you've acknowledged it.
Yes, that is what I think. We are free to debate this, but I do think that actually, far from detracting from the study, it helps us to understand where he's coming from at the outset. And he tells us in very great detail where he's coming from, which work has influenced the way he's carried out his study. So what that means is we can understand how he has made his judgments in that research. Sometimes people don't tell us anything about that in research, and it's quite common actually in the more scientific end of research for people to stay quite aloof and not to tell us too much about what they're assuming. And with a lot of practice you might be able to work out what they're assuming, but that does assume that you've got a lot of background knowledge yourself. But I suppose my question is, however we do research, can people come at it in a very detached way? In other words, without bringing any values into that process. Do we think that can happen?
I don't think it's possible to be completely removed because you're always going to have your own personal opinions. Something that Cowburn did, I picked up on, was he said there was a need to inhibit his natural reactions. And he drew upon some other research of coping mechanisms that was used for new inmates, if I remember correctly. And he adopted these kind of mechanisms to try and make his research easier.
Yes.
And to try and stop his kind of research from being, from being compromised. He was faced with like a difficult dilemma, because if he removes himself, if he goes in from his standpoint and makes it clear what his standpoint is, the people that he's trying to research are just going to close up, they're not going to talk to him. So it's difficult for him to kind of keep the balance between keeping his own opinions quiet so that he can kind of maintain the quality research that he's trying to obtain.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And I was just going to add, and that had its own problems, didn't it? Because then he also had to come up with mechanisms to fit in with the prison officers and the guards, and he was aware that his behaviour then could go to either one of two ways. It was very interesting, actually. I think the way he went into such detail about all of those issues.
Yeah, to probably answer the question, it's probably almost impossible to completely detach yourself, but perhaps in certain situations you can suppress your own kind of reactions and feelings to get the job done, really.
Yes, and I do think that's what he was trying to do. I mean,
He found it hard, though, sorry to cut. Yeah, he did find it hard, though, when he was interviewing Martin.
Yes.
And he found it very hard to suppress his feelings then, because obviously Martin was trying to justify the reason why he had committed the crime that he did.
Yes.
And he found it frustrating that he was still trying to justify it, even though he was trying to push Martin into just say, yes, I've done it wrong, but instead he was just trying to justify what he did.
Yes, the unjustifiable, really. Yes, yes. And I found that really interesting when I first read it. Some of you know, I mean, I used to use this in teaching because it does raise such interesting issues. And I actually thought myself about the ethical issues, which I think, Liam, you raised at first. Did he put Martin under a huge amount of pressure by carrying out that interview? And ethically, should he have done that, do we think?
I don't think he put him under any pressure, because the way it was worded wasn't it wasn't trying to say, you've done this crime and you've done it and you should just own up to it. It wasn't that way. He was just trying to, if you notice the language that he uses, he's trying to get him to just admit to it, to like just kind of admit fault sort of thing, instead of trying to push the blame. Yeah. So I don't think he was wrong for going about it the way that he did, but in reading it, you can see the frustration that Cowburn had in the interview.
Yes.
I think linking back to harm, though, he notes on two different separate occasions that the participant ended up distressed and crying, and again that he used his power to make him feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
Which would go against a risk of harm. He may not be physically harming this person, but emotionally he's caused distress to him at least twice.
Yes, so that is really quite a thorny issue. I mean, it does tell us quite a lot. I've thought really hard about this myself, because clearly it's not right to make somebody distressed as part of the research process, although I don't think we know whether he gave him the opportunity to withdraw from it.
Was that his intention, though?
No, I certainly don't think it was. What I found interesting, actually, was what Martin said and how Martin justified his own behaviour. It tells us quite a lot about his mind and about how he could commit that crime, which we think is awful. But he managed to justify it to himself. So that detailed data is very interesting for criminologists, isn't it? But then there is that dilemma. What should we do? And of course, some of you will know, you'd probably have looked at ethical guidance. And if we followed the ethical guidance in a very rule-bound way, perhaps no one would ever do research in this way, which might be quite sad, because there's certainly information that has been gained from that tells us something that is important, that you couldn't get from a large-scale study.
There's a certain way that research needs to be carried out as well, in order for the participant to be willing to divulge such graphic information about their lifestyle or their life or what they've done throughout their life or what's made them commit the crime that they've done. You know, so I think even though we have these ethical guidelines, not all of them will fit in with the research that you're carrying out. You know, or you might have to take a different approach.
Yes.
But still keep you one eye open on the code of ethics.
Yes, okay. I think really what you're trying to say there, Abby, is that just as there are different perspectives on research, there are also different perspectives on ethics too. And I think for me, and I think from what some of you have been saying, the most important thing though is that we don't harm people, because actually if there is harm that comes out of research, it does put research into disrepute, and so maybe that is something we have to be very mindful of. But it is important to think about different ways of approaching research ethically, and trying all the time to make sure that we minimise harm. But there might be situations where we have to break some of the guidance. For example, confidentiality might be one of them. If someone reveals something in the process of research that is putting someone else at risk, then
It's actually law, isn't it?
yes, yes. So there are always situations, some people call it situational approach to ethics, where we might want to say, in this context, the rule doesn't quite fit, so we have to be discerning about that. Okay, going back, no, we haven't finished going around the room actually, have we? I think, Shona, had you made every point that you wanted to make about?
I was going to make a point about the ethics of Martin, I think it was, who cried. I think if you were carrying out a research in a different area and that was the end result, then ethically that would be very wrong. But I think it's very difficult for those situations to not happen, even if the ethics, you're accountable to how you carried them out ethically, because of the nature of the research. And
Yes.
I think that's just understandable. And as you said, you would never have got that valuable data without that being carried out. And I think that in its own validates that end result.
Yeah,
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. If you couldn't get that data another way, maybe that justifies the means. Maybe with the proviso,
Yes,
with the proviso that it doesn't seriously harm someone. I
Absolutely,
think. Yes,
Because
Yeah.
surely that's the whole point of research, and it's
Yes.
the whole point of, if you look at a lot of the big psychological experiments, you know, like Milgram.
Yes.
So the other night they were talking about it on the radio.
Yes.
But isn't that really a lot of the big psychological? I mean, I obviously talk about psychology experiments, but you know, a lot of them they're very groundbreaking. They brought up an awful lot of uncomfortable thoughts about ourselves and behaviours, etc. But
Yes.
nowadays you couldn't do them, and it's
Although
there was-
people haven't they? They've reproduced
couldn't-
the
you couldn't-
Milgram study.
yeah. You couldn't really not
No.
to be perfectly honest, you couldn't do what we're doing now. And actually, I think that you're in the area. I genuinely think you should not be causing any harm. You should not. It is under any circumstances. I don't think there's a justification for causing harm, causing distress, particularly to vulnerable people. You know, the oath that doctors swear is do no harm, and I think that whether it be in the medical field or this field, I think that you cannot do harm, and it is distressing if you take somebody to the edge for your own, because really it's for your own research purposes.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure the overarching value in distressing people. I don't think any one person or any one researcher or even group of researchers' work, in my opinion, in this arena is ever worth a potential long-term effect and damage to somebody, I don't think there can be a justification for it. So I must admit, although I'm not entirely comfortable with that, I have to say.
No. Well,
I'd agree with that. I think it's almost a Kantian consequentialist dilemma here, and the bottom line, that is harm no one, do no harm, must hold. Can you tell me, it strikes me that this is a very interesting study that makes the distinction between being conscious as researcher of where one's coming from, and being conscious also, or thoughtful, of how others in the field of research come into research, either making it explicit where their values lie or not, which was your point earlier on. But we all come into the game of research with value base. And in this instance, the researcher is very explicit and uses a declared focus to structure the approaches to be taken. There is a clear recognition of what would constitute good conduct, I think, throughout. And there, regardless of where one's coming from in value terms, conduct is key. We need to be rigorous, we need to be consistent, we need to be truthful, we need not to deceive, we need not to intend harm. We might recognise when the process of interviewing or researching needs to pause or be refocused somewhat as a consequence of harm apparently occurring. Is the researcher engaged in encouraging an encounter with realities on the part of the researched? That's a task for another, perhaps. This research appears to succeed in generating valuable data. This research does not present, in my mind, as research to have crossed those boundaries which are so important to recognise, as Wendy was suggesting. And if in the course of an interview an individual becomes conscious of self themselves, then this is a result that is not necessarily harmful. It could be awakening.
And I think, I don't know, are you familiar with the term reflexivity? I think he does demonstrate that all the time he's reflecting upon his own role in that process of research. And in talking about that, he's giving other researchers pointers as to how to carry out research in a way, as you said, Andrew, that is really valuable but not actually causing huge problems, I think. Hayley and Liam, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we get into some other issues? Anything else that struck you when you read the article?
Just the issues really that kind of were presented from coming from his standpoint, and like, obviously the pro-feminist approach going into quite a male-dominated environment, especially at that time. It shows really how well he coped with the situations that he was faced with. So, you know, he was subject to, listening in on conversations that perhaps, for his standpoint, was offensive. So I just think he coped quite well with the scenario, really.
Yes.
So,
Yes, and I think one of you said, I'm sorry I've forgotten who, but I think one of you said that he was using, it was actually Goffman's work he was using.
That's it, yeah.
So those of you who are familiar with sociology and social psychology, Goffman often was focused on the details of people's lives, how they actually present themselves in different situations. So Cowburn, as the researcher, was trying hard to present himself in a way that actually didn't give the game away. So although he did have an agenda, he was doing pro-feminist, anti-sexist research, he wasn't involved in trying to, as I said before, lead people into saying the things that he wanted them to say. Do you have anything else to add, Hayley? Okay, I'd like to come back to this issue then of bias and neutrality and the role of values in research, because when you first started talking, those were issues that came up, and I noticed that they often do come up when research is carried out from a perspective like this. I mean, I would say this is a critical approach because it is coming from a very overt standpoint, and it's trying to challenge sexism. So it's sexism within a prison setting, but obviously sexism is something that is happening in our everyday lives. So I'd like to come back to this issue. When you use the term bias, what is it you mean? Was Cowburn biased?
I wouldn't say he was biased.
No, I wouldn't say he was either.
No, because he that's another thing. He definitely elucidates within the article exactly what the effects are of being like a woman prison officer, a female prison officer, and he expands upon the way male officers approach the women staff, how they're treated and stuff like that, and he because of that, I don't think he can be biased because he's looking at it from both sides, from the officers, from the prisoners, down to the women, to the female officers, you know, so I don't think he could be biased.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Because in some research on prison life, you do get sometimes either someone's taking the side, if you like, of the prisoner, or the side of the prison officers, you know, coming from those perspectives. He's not doing that. He's trying to look at the whole thing, but he's looking at this issue of sexism, isn't he? And where it occurs within that setting, irrespective of who it is that's exhibiting that sexism. So, yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. But it does differ from what you said, Wendy, doesn't it, at the beginning? It's a different approach to the approach that you're used to in your research. Yeah. And I say different because I wouldn't want to say that it's better or that it's inferior. It's different. And it's, to use a common phrase really, it's horses for courses. It depends on the research that you're doing, and I think as researchers we always have to think about what is it, and I think you did say this too, Wendy, what's our purpose, what are we trying to do here in our research? So if you have a very clear idea of what it is you want to do in the first instance, then you can start thinking about how do you approach it, what methods am I going to choose, because unless you do that, you might choose methods that are inappropriate to your research question. So, given that it's very different, Wendy, I wonder if you could tell me what you think about this idea of coming at research from a very specific standpoint.
Well, it's pretty alien from what I was indoctrinated into doing. Yes. So yes, probably that's why I probably think it doesn't feel quite right. But I acknowledge just because it doesn't feel quite right doesn't mean it's wrong. I would always say I'm not entirely convinced whether even if you come from a particular standpoint, we all bring, even subconsciously, so much in. And although you're wanting to try and say, well, look, I'm backing every ideal here, I'm looking at it from every angle, I'm not entirely sure how you can really do that. I think in the ideal world, we'd love to all be able to look at any situation and be able to say, I can see every side of it, and I'm going to evaluate every side of it. I'm just not entirely convinced that whether you can. And I think that's one of some equally, the counter argument of that is you're saying, well, I'm going to be completely detached. I suppose arguably how actually successful can one be in doing that either?
I
so
think we're meeting each other around the back, actually. As you're talking, I'm thinking, well, I'm very glad you raised that, because I think the point of doing the research in the way that Cowburn has done it is actually to acknowledge that truly we can't see every angle. We can't. And sometimes what we do in the process of research, we start to see yet another angle, which is why research diaries are really important, or a log, because if you write down, suddenly something will happen. It might make you think about your own perspective and what you're doing, and that's a very important element of research. But I think the idea that we can be completely neutral and the idea that we can see everything, both of those ideas are problematic because we can't. I think people who state their perspective in this way are simply showing that they have got an angle. And you are free, really, once you've looked at how they've made their judgments, you are free to accept their arguments or to question those arguments, but at least you know why they've made those arguments. Sometimes we don't know that. We can pick up a piece of research and it will look as if that person hasn't put any of their values into it at all. On the surface, it will look like that. But I think, as you were quite rightly saying, Wendy, we know that that can't be the case. That does bring me to another question, actually. Sorry, yes. No,
would you say there was more honesty then in this approach?
I do think that. I do think that. I think sometimes what can happen, particularly in smaller scale pieces of research, is that there's a tendency for science to be used to put that research down for a variety of reasons, but often because it's not replicable, because the results can't be generalised. I would say if the researcher is not making any attempt to generalise, but they're saying we've got some information here that's really helpful, then it's not good to criticise them on those grounds. You might criticise them on other grounds, but not on those grounds. And I would say those are research criteria that are more relevant to the scientific approach when you are doing a large-scale, usually quantitative study, where those criteria are particularly important. In these smaller ones, we're looking more at validity, and whether or not the researcher has tried their hardest to actually make sure that they've not led the research in a particular way. So I think there are different reasons for doing research, there are different ways of doing research, and they each have value. That's what I would say. But I wouldn't like to use one or the other to say something that is outside of one theory of knowledge shouldn't be critiqued from another theory of knowledge. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm saying that clearly, but
that makes sense.
I think it should be looked at within its own theory of knowledge, and not from outside of that. You might get different information by coming from outside, and you would get information, but the research question would probably be different.
This is a very honest paper, as you indicated, and it's a model really for how those working from within different traditions might just be conscious of where they're coming from, make clear their position. Critically, I should think we might expect a degree of common ground, regardless of one's value base, with regard to the conduct of research. And I have to say, I detect no evidence of a fall from grace in this regard with Cohen's work. We could move on to consider what is done with the findings from this study as the third element of the inquiry, which is the interpretation. And here, I think, to imagine that you can operate in some box without a theory of value presents us some difficulty, unless one simply reports findings from the field in anodyne descriptive terms. So what is to be made of that which is discovered is the question that I'm sure Cabo would want to write lots more about. It goes a little beyond the focus of this paper.
Yes, yes. I mean, that brings us on to another very big issue, actually, because sometimes researchers don't have control over what is said about their research. You know, so...
Indeed, the power of the commissioner.
Yes, yes. Do you have any thoughts on that question? Interesting question about what is done with the information.
I suppose it depends what you've done the research for. If it's one study I did was included in a book because there was secondary follow-up studies, and within the field of children's drawings and eyewitness testimony, so it was used for that. So it was used to back up further evidence because it was another small study.
Right.
So I suppose it really depends what you're going to do with the
Yes.
findings as to whether people are going to how far they're going to pick it apart as to what they're going to do with it. And
well, actually,
yes.
politics enters into
Yeah.
it as well. So there's a whole
depends who you're doing it
debate.
for. Yes.
Yes.
If you're doing one
Yes.
for a sort of health service trust, and you're looking at, as I did before, at a treatment pathway, it's very difficult. But on single case designs, because the heterogeneity of the group, it makes it impossible. So you're just doing a standalone study, but
Yes.
it really just goes into maybe an archive because. The samples and what you're looking at, you might be able to look at it and say, well, yes, it's been a success, but you can't say it's been a success over whether somebody's been in for a year or 30 years or something.
No, that's right. That's the
possible.
difficulty.
But that's where the joy of single case designs. It's actually looking, because you are just looking at that one individual. So
Yes.
it's very difficult to know what's going to happen with the study, with the findings, and who's going to want it and for what purpose, political or
Yes.
whatever.
I mean, clearly there's a political angle here to challenge sexism. And I would say that title, critical research, implies that the researcher wants to do something more than just talk about the findings. In other words, they want to develop a theoretical argument to justify bringing about some changes that they think are important. And of course, obviously, if those who have the greatest power don't think that that's the most important thing, it might be quite difficult to do that. Challenges come about, don't they, over a period of time, and changes take place quite often much slower than researchers would like them to. But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. Question I thought of, though, was, Cowburn's a male, and he's carrying out research in an anti-sexist way. He's not carrying out research on women, but he's carrying out research on women and men, actually, but it's not just for women, but it is about being anti-sexist and anti-oppressive, I suppose, I'd like to say. Do you think that's fine, and is it possible for a man to do research in this way? Do you think it would be better carried out by a woman? Have you any thoughts on that?
I think it's absolutely fine for him to be a man and carrying out research in that way, because it comes back to just decency of a human being at the end of the day. And that's what he's looking at, men respecting women and vice versa.
Yes.
So I think to say just because he's a man, he can't look at objectively what's acceptable, how to speak about a woman or treat a woman, is nonsense, really. So I think it's actually quite valuable that it is a man's perspective,
Yes.
a male perspective on it, and not a female perspective.
Yeah, I think it gives quite a unique perspective, really, that perhaps a woman researching that environment maybe couldn't get, because he sees these males and they talk to him as a male, so he gets the true picture.
Yes.
If there was a female researching, the people that they were researching could perhaps tailor their behaviour or say what they think they want to hear, or not say certain things. But with a man, the people that he's researching, especially because the areas he's researching, sexism, then people are going to be open and honest and not hide any minute behaviours.
True picture.
So I think he's actually quite useful to have a man researching those topics in that environment.
So actually what you're saying is, in a sense, it improves the validity
I'd say so,
that he's a
I'd say I
male.
would agree with everything that Liam said, but I'd say it's a risky strategy because for the same reasons, the other side of the argument could be, you know, it's unique, etc. However, it could also be held up by women who are saying, well, actually, how could he possibly? So it's unique, it's interesting, and I think there's a lot of validity. But the downside, I'd say, that he could be opening up an avenue of critique by very nature of the fact that he is a man, and therefore you could arguably say it's quite a risky strategy.
Although it
might pay off, but you quite often when you're looking into research, but if you don't take the odd risk, you're not going to.
Then that's oppressive in itself. A woman's perspective saying, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't be a decent human being and see sex in for what it is because you're a man."
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should say, can women be sexist?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so that's, maybe it's about attitude, whether you're male or female, whether it's, you know, is it about the attitude and the will to be anti-oppressive? Because we could then say, what about researching in areas where there's racism, which would be, again, prison would be a place where we might expect racism to be an issue. Could a white person, for example, carry out a research on racism? Does that change it?
I suppose it changes it in a way, because obviously ethnic minorities get the direct impact of racism, whereas white people do still get racism towards them as well, but I feel like the minority feels it a lot more than what...
You could, though, gain the insight that Liam was talking about, I being the man in the environment with the other men, talking derogatory way about the women. You could also gain that insight being a white person investigating but you would lose something. Gavin, I completely agree
and
with that.
Would the participants be accepting?
Again,
you know, will I be accepting of a white woman trying to tell me about my culture when you haven't been brought up in my culture, or I haven't been brought up in yours, vice versa? Do you know, and this is the thing with Calburn's thing as well, because when he went into the organisation, into the wherever it was, the prison, he states that he could sense that women weren't accepted within this environment. So say if it was a woman researching, you know, it would have been very difficult for her to carry out her research, knowing that, you know, there's certain innuendos and stuff.
No, I think that's interesting, because I think what we're saying is it's never perfect.
No.
It's never going to be perfect. And there might be some people white people who carried out research, let's say, on black people, who haven't actually reflected upon their own assumptions and their own racism. They might not be aware of it, whereas another researcher might have become aware of it and possibly, like Calburn, actually explicitly talk about it. There'll always be gaps, but at least if they're explicitly telling you why they're doing something in a particular way, it's much easier for those who are reading to understand why they've done the research that way. And as I said earlier, to understand those arguments that are being made. So maybe it's the attitude of the researcher that's the important thing.
There's recognition of boundary as well. I mean, experientially, a white person who's never experienced the discrimination that, let's imagine. Well, I can think of an occasion I was researching what Black Caribbean and Indian Pakistani older people could say they would know about housing for older people provided by housing associations and local housing authorities, sheltered housing, and what they would want from such housing. And I remember an encounter focus group, and the midlife Black Caribbean male community leader who was helping me reach older folk explained to me perhaps after or just before, I can't recall. There probably isn't anyone in this room, and I was talking to largely women, I remember, probably from age 55 to 65 or something. There isn't probably anyone in this room who hasn't encountered racial discrimination in their lives. As individuals growing up in the 60s and the 70s in this city, and it made me think profoundly that even if one were able to intellectualize what that might mean, you just would not have that set. The opportunity to co-work with another, the opportunity for one's readings to be read critically by another, the opportunity for there to be a number of research, an opportunity for a clear recognition of boundary, the point beyond which one would need quite possibly either the male to male, black person to black person research encounter. It does present. I have to say that, again, conduct. One remains respectful, consistent, and the nature of my study was really one that wasn't engaging in remembered histories of negative social encounter. It was what do you know about one particular. It was a very prosaic piece of research, but it was a striking moment in some respects.
Do you think there's something to be gained, as researchers, do you think there is something to be gained from having a group of people look through your proposals, and maybe people from different cultural backgrounds, for example? Do you think that helps us to see where we're making assumptions that we are unaware of?
Yes.
Is that something that you do?
And also bring things to your attention that you might not have even been in your conscious, and so you can put more meat to it almost, the research, if you've got different aspects, different opinions and life experiences, and
yes,
you know, like within my family no one's experienced racism, whereas if you're in a family and it's fourth generation, it's completely different.
Yes.
You could generalise it as well. Excuse me, you could generalise it more as well if you have got inputs from different cultures, you know, because you can see every aspect then, and therefore the validity of your research will have a lot more weight on it.
Do you mean you could generalise from your findings more? Or because you'd had someone look at your proposal? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, on your findings. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, I think you could generalise it instead of having somebody else conduct the same research but in a different culture. Maybe you could take that one research and, you know, put it out to put it all.
Do you mean let people comment on it?
Yeah, professionals, yeah.
Not this.
No, but sometimes what happens in research is that in some forms of qualitative research, for example, maybe a research team might start a first analysis of the data, and then having done that, they would give it back to the people that they have researched. In other words, the power of the researcher is being given to those who are being researched, so that they can look at it and say, well, actually, I don't agree with what you're saying there. So there's a kind of another layer of analysis that is coming from the people who are being researched. Again, it does depend on the question, but often in research where people are trying to bring about change, there is a feeling that it's quite important for researchers to let go of the power that they clearly have. And sorry to keep using Wendy as an example here, but in the sort of research that you have probably done, Wendy, from what you've said, the power is all with you. Because you're analysing it and you're doing it to a pretty strict formula, and you'll probably end up looking at whether your findings are statistically significant or not, and that will be the end of it. There won't have been probably any input from the people you're researching with regard to the questions you ask. Whereas in some research, researchers will involve those who are going to be taking part in the study with formulating the research question even, but also going out to them with the analysis and saying, okay, this is our preliminary analysis. This is how we're making sense of it. But also to ask, does this resonate with you? Because again, it's who are we doing this for? I mean, a lot of the time, academics are doing research because it's something they're expected to do. They need to get a research record, and that in itself is an issue, because perhaps it means that academics aren't necessarily always doing the sort of research that they would want to do. It's more about what can they get money for. So sometimes when people cross those boundaries and they say, okay, well, we want to give some of the power back, they might find out different things, as we said earlier, that turn out to be quite important, because we've all got blind spots, if I can put it that way. Lots of things that we just won't be aware of because it's not part of our own experience. So that's one way of going back to people and saying, well, does this make sense to you? I mean, if we go back to the Cowburn article for a minute and we think about Martin, if maybe Malcolm Cowburn had got him to talk about the way he had justified his crimes, but hadn't challenged him on the spot, would he have ended up with that data any other way, and could he have gone back to him with an analysis? I don't know. It would be hard in that situation, I think.
I don't know, because he does say that, like, he gives him a different way to think about what he did, and Martin can't quite. He differentiates with it so much. He's like, it's completely different. He can't associate them together. You can't bring them together as one idea. And he says that in the end, it was his irritation that caused the power play to become apparent. And it was then that he started using his power to make him feel uncomfortable. And I think that's when, if he hadn't put him on the spot as much, if he'd left it and then maybe revisited it in a different approach, realising that his approach wasn't working, if we go about it in a different way later on, then it maybe wouldn't have caused so much discomfort and distress.
No, that's true. I'm just thinking, and I'm really thinking on the spot here, but I'm just thinking if Martin maybe had written that down, his own justification, and then Cowburn had said, yeah, well, actually, I think what you're doing here is minimising the crime that you've committed. You're presenting justifications for this crime that aren't acceptable. Even if he took that back to Martin, his analysis, let's say he took it back to Martin and said, well, this is what I think you're doing here, and the chances are that Martin would still disagree because it's too difficult for him to accept that what he did couldn't be justified. Because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he says he committed that crime out of love.
Yeah.
And actually, in those sorts of sex abuse crimes, that is something that is quite common, and it's very difficult for researchers to hear that and to listen to it, because it's obviously a very distorted view of what most people would think love is. But the fact that in different contexts, other people have got similar data from sex abusers does give us confidence that there's something about this crime and the psyche of those people that commit the crime that enables them to justify the crime to themselves. It tells us about how they do it. So obviously nobody would condone that, but it does help us to understand how those crimes come about, maybe.
It certainly does. I mean, I think if Cowburn's researching what those that he speaks to have to say about their understanding of A, background, and B, their actions, that's quite transparent and clear. From that altogether, then you'd have to be explicit if you were going to research the response of the individual that you were interviewing to a series of challenging questions after having recorded the justification as apparent. It's which would be an interesting area of research, but a very challenging area of research, and a potentially very damaging area of research. Because do we know that the researcher is skilled sufficiently to engage in such an encounter? This is not to recognise that such an encounter may not be productive.
I think he was actually, just to say it, because obviously he'd been working these cases, which is
he was a probation officer prior to
so,
that.
you know, I think he certainly had the knowledge and expertise. Is that what you were saying, really?
Okay, so he does, but then would it have been, does he have the license to travel that boundary? There's a question, I guess. This is a study that generates a lot of very valuable information. It presents as a study that has been undertaken with probity and care, thought, to conduct. It offers an insight into the researcher's own response to that which he experienced. It suggests how the researcher might have put together a supplementary list of questions. I think it was probably wise and sensible within the boundaries of the research and the deal essentially struck between researcher, although implied, and the respondent, that he doesn't progress. There's a whole set of politics that follow on from this, quite obviously.
Yes, but I think you're right. I don't know if the rest of you do, but I think Andrew's right in that there's an awful lot that we can learn from it. Not least, actually, about how to go about doing your research, and maybe when you're looking at the literature before you do your own proposals, to think about what are the sorts of issues that have been raised in this research. And he set out so carefully everything that he did, all the literature that he used, the different types of literature, the theoretical literature, the methodological literature. And so I think it's useful if any of you would be trying to do research from this sort of perspective. Are any of you doing in-depth studies for your MA?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Both me and Wendy are hoping to conduct research within the prison, and I know my contingency plan will be to, if I can't get access to the offenders through qualitative interviews, then I will be conducting an advertisement for response from the particular offender that I'm advertising to. So my research will be in post-tariff IPP offenders and the process that they're going through to be released. If I can't get, because obviously I'm only at master's qualification, if I can't get access to them through interview, I will be advertising in a prison paper for them to contact me through writing.
Right.
So that's the only way I'm going to be able to get their perspectives as in-depth as I'd be able to.
Yeah. So how many people do you hope to interview?
If I do conduct the interviews, they'll be semi-structured and they'll be qualitative, obviously, but I'd be hoping to get quite a large sample of short interviews, hopefully. But there is quite a large population of IPP offenders still that are post-tariff. So for me to conduct research on them, I'd have to be able to get access to a lot of different areas. It's probably not as realistic as I was hoping, which is why I've thought of other ideas of how to access these offenders.
What's the overall purpose of your research then?
I think since, again, I've got my own opinions of my research before I've even conducted it. I think since the abolishment of IPP last year, and even before it was abolished, IPP offenders were having difficulty accessing courses, and because their sentence plan was so specific, even for short sentences, their course access was very limited and very difficult. Some of them were having to transfer prisons like over and over again just to complete the courses that were put on their sentence plan. So for them to act, now that the abolishment's taken place, and obviously the funding isn't there either. So my interest is their personal perspectives on how they'd log to be able to get access to proving that they are eligible for parole now, that they should be released.
Right, okay. So are there any other studies that you know of that have been carried out on that?
Not post-abolishment, no. I'm hoping that something will come out in the new year, January time, but if not, then this will be the most current piece that will be going forward.
Okay. So I imagine that's quite hard for you if there's not a great deal of literature on this.
Every bit of literature that I've got so far is pre-abolishment.
Right, right. And how do you think that changes what you're going to do?
I think my work will be easily picked apart if it is published, because it'll be the first one. As to my knowledge, it's the first one that will be completed by the time that anybody else has done one.
What would you like to see come out of the research?
I think at the moment a lot of offenders feel quite lost with where they are. They haven't got anything now to. They've been for parole, they've been knocked back, and they haven't got much understanding of where they're going to go next and how they're able to prove that they're ready for release. If they've completed all their courses, then how much more have they got to do to prove to be released? And I'm hoping that eventually there's going to be some sort of impact on helping them through that process, so that they know where they're going to go. The parole board do start taking into consideration the efforts that they have to go to prove themselves. They don't get sent to a parole board and released like most offenders. They're having to prove repeatedly throughout their sentence, really, from the minute they arrive in custody to the minute that they go to the parole board, that they are ready to be released.
So if I could put it into sort of research words, are you trying to understand what it's like to be in their situation? Are you trying to get knowledge out there about what it's like to be in their situation?
by gaining knowledge of them, that something will be implemented to help them through this, instead of them being so sort of lost in the system while they're waiting for.
So I'm assuming then you have an idea of policies that you would like to see in place, maybe.
I think obviously IPP was brought in because they felt that determinate sentences weren't adequate. The tariff that was set was half of what the determinate sentence would have been anyway. Those that are still serving IPPs, if they have not been proven of adequately, of even trying to rehabilitate, then maybe they should be given an extended sentence instead of continuing an IPP. Whereas the people that are continuing their courses and completing their courses and then sitting around waiting to be told where they're going to go next, I think maybe a programme should be put into place for them to maybe be pushed for release, or at least begin reintegration sooner.
So you have some very clear ideas there, don't you, about what you would like to come from your research?
I think it's really good. I'm an ex-offender, so I think what you're doing is brilliant.
Oh, it's really interesting.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Help with the rehabilitation. it
Yeah.
needs it. Definitely.
Great. Anything else that you'd like to talk about in terms of your own research?
I'm a little bit in the same boat as Hayley in terms of there's not much. I'm going to be doing the abuse that happens in care homes, and also I'm going to look at, I think, the typology of a whistleblower in terms of if there is a typology of a whistleblower.
Oh, right, okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay.
But there's not really that much research, but luckily Donald McIntyre has done stuff and is doing more with a psychologist, I think. So I don't really know how I'm going to carry my research out as yet, but that is what I'm going to do.
Okay, so what could you articulate what your overall purpose is?
To really try and come up with something that can be implemented to put strategies in place that could prevent further abuse in these care homes.
Okay.
And I don't know how, I don't know yet, obviously, but that's what, you know, I want something good to come of it, hopefully.
Okay.
Countering abuse through whistleblowing, where you consider the position that exists between the state of abuse stopped, never begun, punished, and the whistleblower. And so what do we know about whistleblowing? What is whistleblowing? Are there types of whistleblowers? Why is whistleblowing? Can we say whistleblowing is good or not? What formal recognition is there to the whistleblower? There's actually quite a lot, isn't there? Encourage the whistleblower, and it's not just within the context of residential care for old people.
Oh, absolutely.
It's whistleblowing.
Yeah,
It's time for a cultural revolution, everyone.
Yeah.
The apparatchiks had better watch out, and if you're on the front line and something's up, shout out. So Mid-Staffs Hospital presents. It's very topical.
Yeah. I mean, there are things that have come out already since the exposures programme and things like that. There's a phone line now, I think it's called Silver Lining for the elderly. And there's, there are things happening, so there's probably more out there than I am aware of as yet, but I'll have to just do it somehow.
It's quite hard though at the early stages,
Absolutely.
isn't it, to work out exactly what it is you want to do. And again, that may be where having a research
You've been helpful,
log
though, Andrew, with that.
is
Sorry.
I said you've been helpful just
Oh,
with
right.
all that.
but having a log really about where your ideas began and where they've ended up and why you may have changed your position a little bit is really important. And I think that's actually as important as some of the data that you'll get.
I think that's why I'm in this sort of, I was sort of thrown a bone from David as to this project would be a good idea.
Yes.
And going into a prison and all the ethicals, as we were talking about, and the ethical guidelines, and especially with vulnerable adults, or for anybody who's vulnerable, is so great, and the hurdles you have to go through in terms of your ethical research through norms, etc. So sometimes you've got to actually stand back and say, well, actually, is there really a project in here? Is there really something that is going to bring something to the field? All the things I alluded to at the beginning, and is there really going to be something? And sometimes that's the hardest thing in research, is actually when somebody throws you a bone, the automatic reaction is, I'm going to run, and then sometimes you do have to stop and think, actually, how is this really going to work out? Is there going to be a good research question in here?
Yes.
And ultimately, what's the purpose of this? And am I going to acknowledge? Am I going to? And that's the point I've reached, is actually, which is now the only substitute has been to do what I'm going. Not substitute. The only credible way forward is to do what I'm doing later today, which is actually be the woman on the ground, as it were. Go in there, experience the very thing I'm trying to evaluate, and actually get a bit of an idea as to how many people might be able to take part in my study. And because you cannot write proposals, particularly for university and ethical guidelines, submitting forms, and also into the prison service, etc., unless they feel that you've got a really credible bit of research there.
Yes.
And so that the very first point actually is to try and actually work out what the proposal and whether it's worth. Research is always worth it, but whether it's actually going to be worth it. And sometimes the hardest thing is to sometimes walk away and say, actually, this isn't going to work on so many levels. And at least with, I suppose, you can answer those questions as to why your research isn't going to work.
Yes.
And why it's not worth trying to go through all the extra hurdles to actually get the approval to do it. Because arguably you won't get approval, and especially if you're working in a university setting and you've got time constraints.
Yes,
an
that's the big
academic
issue,
year.
isn't it?
You can't. It doesn't. Academic dissertations or theses, whatever. You don't have. You have a finite length of time to bring it in, and therefore sometimes you have to ask yourself very hard questions as to, I might want to do this, but it's just not going to work, and the timescales and the. It's just, or actually, it's of no value.
Yeah,
I'm going to spend my time doing something which is good, and write 15,000 words, and someone's going to look at it and open it and say, "Excuse me, what's the point?"
Yes, it's like there was a piece of research on something like how long cornflakes stay crunchy or something that I remember was publicised. I don't know how long ago it was now. It's fairly recently, but you kind of think.
Time is
right.
precious, isn't it?
I suppose it must be really important for people in marketing. But yeah, you do have to be prepared as a researcher to be knocked back a bit sometimes. The tendency, I think, for most people is to start out thinking this big and you think you can do so much, and actually a lot of the best piece of research are this big, that, think small actually is quite important, especially for students who have got limited finance, limited time. If the smaller you can think, the more likely it is that you're going to produce something that is of value.
Operationally, but worth imagining what possibilities there could be, and always situating your bounded activity within context that explains its situation and explains, by extension, how your work could blossom.
Well, yes, and I think often the way research works, we tend to think of it in isolation, but actually what happens is, by the process of review that we're all involved in, because the first thing you do when you do a piece of research is review the literature, but by that process of reviewing, we become more knowledgeable, and we work out what our own perspective is and realise that we can't do everything in a piece of research. So that teaches us how to narrow our research down. And I think that process also teaches us that actually, particularly in the smaller scale pieces of research, what we do is see that different pieces of research that are similar but not identical, but carried out in different settings, start to build up a picture that might give us confidence in a particular theory that is being developed. Okay, I think that's what happens. We start looking wider, and we see that this bit here and this bit here is telling us the same sort of thing, and eventually we get more confidence in what we're thinking. So maybe it just teaches us to see our limitations, but also to acknowledge that we can make fairly small steps that in the future might become a bigger step that might help someone to change a policy in the way that you're talking about. Liam, have you told us about your research?
Well, we've actually just submitted an article to the Howard Journal.
Oh, great.
I worked as a research assistant alongside David Wilson, Donald McIntyre and Elizabeth Yardley. And the paper was about contract killing in the UK. So hiring a hitman to kill somebody. There's actually only been 5 research studies on it worldwide. So what we did was, using Nexus, we kind of searched for any cases, reported cases of convicted hitmen in the UK. Got together all their demographic information of the hitman, the victim and the hit, put it into a database, and then analysed this database for any kind of trends that emerged. And we kind of took a critical approach to a guy called Schlesinger. He came up with a typology of hitmen in Australia. But he based his whole typology that there was an amateur, semi-professional and a professional hitman on just one case of a professional hitman who took out over 100 people. But so from the cases that we looked at, we just found that we could not apply the cases to that typology. It just wouldn't work. So we developed a new typology really exclusively for British hitmen. So we came up with the cases where the typology was a novice, a dilettante, a veteran and a master. And so we came up with 4 different types.
And how many people did you look at?
We came up with 36 cases, which we think is a little bit of an underestimate. But look, the data was kind of saturated by the end of it, so we just found what we could find. And then from that, we were able to identify characteristics and draw up a typology from that. So.
Still quite small to say this is the typology.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But nevertheless, actually finding some information that is different and it might, I suppose, in the future even challenge the idea that there is a typology. I don't know. You know, it could even do that. Couldn't it?
There's some interesting findings though.
Very interesting.
The youngest one we found was 15 when he carried out his hit. So for £200.
Any females?
One
that
we came across.
How old was she?
One. She was 28, I think she was. Yeah, and she was Maori. Was it Maori?
Maori.
Maori. That's it. Yeah, Maori. Yeah. So just the one female we came across. But
they haven't called me yet.
Did you do in-depth interviews?
No, we didn't do interviews. I think I think Donal may have had an interview, but obviously I couldn't be involved in that just because of the ethics.
How did you carry out the research itself?
He was using Nexus database search just to find
that was all you
that was because it's just an explorative study to start off with.
I see.
So just to kind of bring the data together and analyse it and see if we can identify any trends and patterns. So I think, but like you said, you start off small and it can build to other things. I think there's 3 or 4 other papers in the pipeline on the back of it. So
absolutely, impressive.
Because if you could talk to those people,
I think that's the plan.
In depth, you get something about their life histories, wouldn't you? That might actually explain how they came in to,
especially the female. That could be a very interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. The range of reasons and the ages, and the 15-year-old shocked me more than anything. You know, to be in a position where you think, for £200 to actually kill somebody.
It doesn't shock me as much just because of the wars that go on in other countries. The soldiers that they recruit, 8, 9, and they go out with guns.
Of course, yeah.
So actually, you can indoctrinate. Can't remember words out. A much earlier age in a certain environment.
I think just in British society, like for a 15-year-old to shoot dead a mother of 1 or 2 on a doorstep,
that's shocking to be in this country.
Yeah. So.
I can't remember who the study's by now, but there is a study on gun crime in this country. I'm sorry, my mind's just gone blank. But there is a study that I do remember looking at, and they're looking at the different levels, so the people who are supplying the guns, and then those who are actually involved in using the firearms. Generally are quite young and powerless. It's quite interesting.
Trying to impress older people, I think it is.
Well, I don't think it's even that. I think it might be to do with their lives and feeling quite hopeless about the future. And those who are actually setting these crimes up, being able to distance themselves from the young people whose lives seem to count for not very much, which is really quite sad. I'll have to let you know what the study is if I can find it.
I'll probably ready at some point.
You can tell I've retired.